Good
Perfect.
morning from Sunny Isles, Florida. There's the intracoastal, and the temperature here is 26 degrees
Yeah. Well,
Celsius. I was going to say I got stuck here in Florida, but the Rebbe once told a group of
Good
the
morning,
Rebbe
Rabbi
once
and everyone.
the Rebbe once told a group of women who were stranded in an airport in Detroit, I think it was, and they notified the Rebbe that they were stuck in Detroit. And the Rebbe, through his secretary, said to the women, "What is the meaning of stuck?" So they thought the Rebbe's had a difficulty understanding the meaning of the English word stuck. So they tried to explain what it meant. So the Rebbe's secretary says, the Rebbe knows what the word stuck means. He just doesn't understand how a Jew could refer to being in a place that he's stuck there. He was put there by divine providence to do something, to accomplish something. And the women went around and they gave out candles to all the other women, Jewish women, to light for Shabbos. So I'm not stuck in Florida. By divine providence, I ended up here on Shabbos. I had to speak in honor of the Hasidic holiday of Yud Shvat, and I was supposed to come back last night. That flight was canceled, so I'm here challenged in Florida. And I hope everyone can get some of the warmth through the technology. And thank God for technology. This can only be possible in light of the technological advances of the last few decades. Today, we're going to continue the discussion of the journey of the soul, grief and consolation. And the questions that we're going to try to address are: how do we mourn and heal from the loss of a loved one? And what is the best way to comfort someone who has lost a loved one? And this theory and this practice, there's a lot of things that in theory they're supposed to work. In practice, they may not work, but we have to make the best effort that we can make. It's never easy. Yes, Jewish tradition has objective ways of dealing and confronting death and grieving, but one thing should be made clear at the outset: Jewish mourning rituals certainly have tremendous psychological benefit. There's no question about that, and we'll discuss that as we go on. But when we deal with Jewish law, and we deal with all the commandments in the Torah, they're not designed specifically for some psychological benefit. Like we observe Shabbat. Shabbat is, for psychologists will tell you, it's the greatest invention for one's psyche, where he has a day of rest and tranquility. But we don't observe Shabbat because of that. That is a byproduct. That is a side benefit that accrues from observing God's commandment. Circumcision is another example. Circumcision has many health benefits, but we don't circumcise for the health benefits. We circumcise because it's our covenant with God. And I can go on and on discussing so many different commandments that have tremendous physical, psychological, and emotional benefit, but that is a side benefit, a byproduct of the original intent of the mitzvah, which is our way of connecting to God. So with that introduction in mind, we're going to approach the Jewish tradition's ideas as translated in their practices concerning grief and mourning. On the booklet that you have on page 1, it starts off with the story of a Heather Lindquist. I'm not going to read the whole story. I think you could read it yourself. It's a little bit very emotional to read. And the gist of the story is that this woman experiences a sudden jolt in her life when her husband, who was suffering from asthma, falls to the ground and passes away. And now she's a single mother, 34 years old, She had two boys, 5 and 7. And at that moment, the death of her husband felt like the worst thing that could ever have happened to her. And she lived a very quiet life, very, very, very easy life, you could say. They had a house, they had children, they had a dog, the schools were good. She had very little to complain about. And all of a sudden, she's thrust into this new situation where she's a single mother, and she has to now fend for herself. And what happened was she found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times, but she found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. And this is what she says in the last paragraph on page 3. I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, but I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I love those boys so much. So here's a woman who's able to readjust to life and manage her life very successfully, notwithstanding the grief and the blow that she sustained. And here you have the next story, text 2, overwhelmed by grief. This is a story about another woman, Stephanie Moldberg, who loses her son, 13, and she's walking around like a zombie. She's 48 now. She felt guilty all the time, guilty about living. And she goes on to describe how she was more or less emotionally paralyzed. She couldn't talk to her friends. They didn't want to hear about it anymore. And she would shut the door on her birthday, take the phone off the hook. Eric, her son, couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I? She said. So we have two extremes, I think, over here. Someone who's able to cope, and some people would say she's in denial. No, she wasn't in denial. She just had the strength to be able to cope with this terrible loss. And Stephanie, is she overreacting? Which it's an extreme overreaction, you could say, but it's not, you can't say one is right and one is wrong. There are no single responses to loss that you could say this response is right and this one is wrong. People are humans. Human beings have emotions, and no two human beings are the same. So, what does Judaism say to this loss? If I had to summarize Judaism's approach, I would say that, as in many other situations, Judaism is very often the middle of the road, is moderation. And we see that in so many of the commandments that the Torah tells us to reach certain levels, and it recognizes that human beings are limited, and some human beings could climb higher and some cannot. So we have to find the perfect medium that will give us the ability, on one hand, to grieve and to grieve seriously grieving and not just denying what happened by ignoring the grief, at the same time to not overly grieve. So in the last classes, we discussed death from the perspective of the soul. Now we're going to discuss it from the perspective of the bereaved survivors. First, a little bit of an introduction of how some philosophers refer to death. Socrates glorified death. He was sentenced to death and he was put to death, and he glorified it. So obviously, if you glorify death, realizing that death is an integral part of existence, this is part of the biological system. We can't overcome death, it would seem, although Judaism believes that we can, and we'll discuss that in the last class of the series. But as things stand today and has stood for this way for millennia, we cannot conquer death. So why should we mourn? It's part of life. We don't mourn after we lose a tooth. So why should we mourn after we lose life? That was more or less the philosophical approach of Socrates and many others since his day. And Maimonides, who sums up all of Jewish law it's not his own ideas, says very clearly, we are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. What he means by next of kin, we're referring to the closest relatives, parents, siblings, children, and spouse. So these are the ones that the Torah mandates that we have to mourn their deaths. And even a Kohen who is biblically commanded not to come in contact with the dead, but he is allowed, and not only allowed, but required to come in contact with the grave of his next of kin, the ones I just enumerated. So we know for sure that we have a biblical commandment. The first day is biblically mandated. That the rabbis introduced the idea of Shiva, and a Shiva, which means 7, as we discussed in the last class, is the period that the rabbis added on with some hints in the Torah. Now, one could understand the idea of why biblically one day and rabbinically more than one day, that we can understand that in light of the benefits that grieving has for the person, or the need to accommodate a person's emotions. Sometimes some people could do it in one day. That's very, very challenging. So the rabbis, recognizing that some people need more, either they need more time to grieve, they need more time to adjust to the new situation in their lives. Now, Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. Nachmanides, as you see, was born a few years before Maimonides passed away, and he was in many ways similar to Maimonides, many ways different, but he was considered the greatest rabbi of his time. He was also a physician, he was also a philosopher, he was also a great Jewish leader, and one of the most important sources of Jewish law. So he says the following in his commentary on the Torah. The Torah does not forbid us to weep, because in response to death he's talking about, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they are alive. Even if a person just physically moves away, we feel a void. So how much more so when someone passes away? So it's a natural thing, and the Torah does not forbid us. And the reason why that is the Torah recognizes and respects our human feelings and our human perceived reality. What I mean by that is there's a statement in the Talmud that Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, did not die. Even though it appeared that he died, he didn't really, we can't call what happened to him death. That's something unique about Jacob. We're not going to go into why Jacob and not Abraham, not Isaac, why not others. So the Talmud asked the question, well, why did they bury him? Why did they embalm him? Why did they eulogize him? So the answer is because it appeared in their reality that he died. In other words, there are two realities. There's a spiritual higher reality, and there is the reality of human beings. And the Torah respects our reality, and it recognizes the fact that even though on a higher plane, you can't consider what happened death, but we're not on that higher plane. We are on the plane where we experience death and we relate to it, and we do have natural human emotions to grieve. That has to be respected, because the Torah came to this world, was given to us to refine the world, to affect the world, to elevate the world. So it recognizes that the world is part of the world is our consciousness, our reality. Our reality should not be looked down upon and saying, well, that's terrible that you have that reality, you should ignore it. No, the Torah doesn't want us to ignore it. The Torah wants us to embrace it and elevate it. And the way we do that in terms of death is by observing the laws of Shiva, the laws of mourning, the laws of grieving. In his Guide for the Perplexed, cited on page 6, Maimonides says mourners find comfort in crying. Now here he's giving the benefit, the emotional benefit that we get from mourning. They find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil. just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of lighthearted activities. In other words, he's saying it's nature to mourn, and it shouldn't be suppressed. It's not a negative. It's something that is very, very much important. And the grieving process itself is cathartic. The grieving process itself helps us adjust. There are stories of people who couldn't grieve, people who survived the Holocaust. And I remember some of these people who told me that it took years after the Holocaust for them to start crying. I know a story of a distant relative of mine who lived in Russia, in the part of Russia, I think it was Uzbekistan, and there was a terrible famine. This is during World War II, and people were dying on the streets. And this child, who is my sister-in-law's father, sister-in-law through marriage's father, was one of those children who saw the death of who knows how many close relatives of starvation. And after things were over, the war was over and things got better, he couldn't cry. The child couldn't cry. And a senior chassid, an older man, took him under his wings and to counsel him and help him. And there was one day he started crying, and this chassid started dancing for joy that he was able to express his emotions. Of course, later on, he grew out of it and he was able to cope. But crying is not to be viewed as something negative. If a person feels the need to express the grief through crying vocally or crying inside, but vocally is much better in terms of being able to heal, that's a reason to rejoice, because it shows that your emotions that have been damaged so severely by the loss are now recuperating. Then there's a text over here on page 6 from the Radvaz. That's the abbreviation of his name, Rabbi David ben Zimra. He was one of the great Sephardic leaders in the 15th, 16th centuries. He lived almost a century. And he has responses where people would ask him questions of Jewish law. He has a few thousand responses to matters of Jewish law in several volumes. And here's a question that someone raised, and he quotes one of this generation's greatest personalities who fed to shell a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? The argument would be it's stoicism. The guy is stoic, he's strong, he's able to control his emotions so intensely. And Radvaz's answer was, no, such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. It's a sign that you are insensitive, totally insensitive. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that this world is without purpose. He's referring to some philosophers who felt that nothing has any value, life is valueless. It's like the people, I mentioned this in a class recently, the people who, there was a professor who said that people after the age of 75 should be euthanized, they're no longer useful. People who have that very perverted view will argue that grieving is not important. By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. So he's taking it from the perspective that life here has value, and it's a prelude to a much more blissful existence in the world to come, which we discussed in the past classes and we'll discuss more in future classes. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious. Not only is it acceptable, is it kosher, it's a sign of piety. The prophets and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, 30 for restrictions and wearing new clothing and getting haircuts, etc. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, it doesn't mean that you're obligated to weep 3 days and not 2 days and not 4 days. It means that those are the first 3 days after the loss of a close relative. Those are the days that are most suited for expressing grief through weeping. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her. The Torah makes it very clear. And of course, Abraham is one of the paragons of virtue in Judaism. And that Jacob, ignore the 1718, that's a typo. And that Jacob and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise. The Torah is replete with examples of great people who are venerated by our tradition, who grieved and wept and didn't say, well, we're on such a high spiritual level that we're not affected by the loss of a close one because we're too spiritual for that. The next quote on page 8 is a mistake. It was left over from last week's class. I just want to share something that I experienced when the Rebbe lost his wife in 1988. Everyone had a chance, thousands of people, to come to comfort him. They would walk by and say the words of consolation, the words that we're so going to discuss. And I remember seeing the Rebbe for 1 second. You saw such devastation, such pain, I never saw anyone express that just in the way his face looked. And here we're talking about the most spiritual person, the most stoic person when it came to his own pain and suffering. You saw a person who was so spiritual, so godly, able to control all of his emotions and all of his desires, someone who's a paragon of virtue, and so devastated. I never saw another person in my life, just looking at the face, to be as devastated as he looked. And I should note also, although this is subjective, of course, that when the Rebbe lost his mother a few decades before that, I also went by and I saw the Rebbe's devastation, but it didn't compare to the pain that you saw he felt with the loss of his wife. So, summary, mourning is respect for human feelings. It's therapeutic, and it also underscores the value of physical life in Judaism. Unlike other religious cultures that glorified the afterlife as being the only thing that has value, and this life is valueless. We discussed this in past classes. That Judaism says this life is really where it's all about, and the loss of life is something to grieve. Now, the laws of mourning, as I mentioned before, are limited to the following: parents, siblings, spouse, and children. What about adopted parents or children? So Jewish law doesn't mandate it, doesn't require it, doesn't obligate us. But of course, if someone loses an adopted parent who went to the extent of taking a strange child into his or her life, nurturing that child, obviously you'll feel pain and grief, and it's perfectly kosher to grieve. But the mandated grieving is only for the closest relatives. So here we go to the mourning process. It goes in different stages, and the different stages are commensurate also with the ability for a person to adjust. Here we have Aninut. Aninut is the first day of the passing of this close relative. Only minimal function is expected. We're not expected to observe all the commandments. Of course, the negative commandments, you can't murder someone in that period. You can't steal from someone. But the positive commandments, prayer, putting on tefillin, reading the Shema, and other positive expressions of faith that are mandated in Judaism, a person on the first day before the burial is not allowed to engage in those commandments, because the attention has to be totally devoted to taking care of the needs of the deceased. And there are exceptions to that rule. On Shabbos, when someone is not allowed to grieve, visibly grieve, then it doesn't apply, and then you could say your prayers and do all the mitzvahs that you do. Also, if you don't have any real role in the burial of the person, everything was given over to the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, and they're taking care of everything. You have nothing more to do, then you do have the responsibilities. Now, in this time, all your actions are aimed at furthering the respect and honor of the deceased. That's the focus. The second stage, the Shiva, it's a time of limited function. Usual duties and routines are suspended. You don't go to work for the 7 days until the end of the Shiva. You don't have the same responsibilities. You still have to do all the mitzvahs. And despite the continuous awareness of the loss, there's a need to function or receive visitors. In other words, you don't really see visitors before the funeral. Now, it doesn't mean that if a person comes to you before the funeral, you should just ignore him, but it's not the time for consoling and comforting the mourner. The focus of the person is on dealing with the deceased. And in the Shiva, that's a time for sharing memories of the deceased, which sharpens the relationship to the deceased and deepens the awareness of what was lost. And there are numerous religious rituals that provide merit to the deceased in the next world. In other words, everything that we do during that week of Shiva that's positive accrues to the virtues of the merit of and the virtues of the deceased in the next world. I remember when the Rebbe was sitting Shiva after his loss of his wife, a very wealthy man, a very big benefactor of many of Chabad's institutions, came to the Rebbe and says, after the Shiva is over, I'm going to establish a new fund for some other cause. I forgot what it was. And the Rebbe says, why wait till after Shiva? That's what Shiva is all about. Shiva is all about people doing things in the merit of the one who's deceased to add to their virtues and to their state in the world to come. And of course, if you're planning on giving charity for something positive, why wait? The people who need the charity could use it before the Shiva is over. Then we get to the Shloshim, the 30 days. Outside responsibilities resume, you go to work and everything else resumes, but there are certain requirements that you have to do to mark the mourning. You don't go to festive events, you don't put on new clothing. During the Shiva, I forgot to mention, during Shiva, we don't wear leather shoes. We cover the mirrors. One of the reasons for covering the mirrors, because a mirror is there for the physical appearance. You want to look good. Time of Shiva is not a time when you focus on your own physical appearance. That's one of the reasons. In the Shloshim, we don't put on new clothing, but we don't have to cover the mirrors. The Shloshim means the 30 days. And then we get to the 12 months. The 12 months is the same as above with reduced emphasis on the loss. But if it's for the parents, there are certain restrictions that still remain. We don't go to festive events. There are some exceptions. You should consult your halachic authority, the authority in Jewish law for the exceptions. There are some times when you're allowed to go to a wedding. If you serve, you act as if you're a waiter there, so you're doing it as work, not just for pleasure, and so on and so forth. Then we get to the Yartzeit, the anniversary. There's continued awareness of the loss, but it doesn't detract in any way from your ability to continue on with life. And on the Yartzeit, any actions and prayers that mark the loss, they strengthen the relationship and the continuing bonds. At a funeral, we also tear our garments. Jewish law requires that you actually tear the actual garment, not a ribbon. That's an American invention that defeats the whole purpose, I think, of rending your garment. But tearing the garment is one way of accepting the reality of the loss. And where do we find in the Torah? We find that in the Torah with Jacob. When Jacob was told that Joseph died, he was killed by a wild animal. And when he recognized that, he says, it's my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph had been torn to pieces. And Jacob rent his garments and placed sackcloth on his loins and mourned his son for many days. We don't wear sackcloth in the case of grieving and mourning, but we do. That is still a commandment to rent our garments. In the case of a relative, it's unlike that are not parents, we rent the right side. If it's parents, it's the left. The left is the symbol of the heart, and loss of parents is considered to be a greater source of grieving. Now, this is a little bit of a question. Why, for all other relatives except for parents, the mourning is maximum 30 days. For parents, it's a full year. One would think that a loss of a spouse, a loss of a child, would be a greater source of pain than the loss of a parent. And yet, for the parents, the obligation of grieving is 12 months. And the reason, one reason at least, is that we're obligated to honor our parents. The honor of our parents is not matched by any other relationship. Sure, we should honor our spouse, we should honor even our children, but it's not the same category as honoring parents. And so that by keeping the mourning process going for a full year and saying Kaddish especially, that is a form of honoring parents. Now, what is the reason for tearing the garment? So one way of looking at it, it counteracts the common response of denial by supplying a tangible and inescapable physical expression of the loss. We are physical beings, and physical beings respond and react to physical actions and physical effects. And here we have a text of a authority of Jewish law of the 18th century, where he says, he quotes Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. Now, this author says, no, in my humble opinion, the opposite is true. I don't fully understand Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz's statement that it distracts you from your grief. I guess the idea is that you're thinking about your suit or your dress, and you're not focused on the grief. It's a little strange. I find it difficult to understand, but this rabbi was relating to what he experienced, so I can't argue with the person's experience. But the Rabbi Huda Ayash, the one who's critiquing, says, in my humble opinion, the opposite is true. And this sounds more reasonable. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience the tremendous loss. But what comes out of both of these explanations is that the rabbis were giving us a balance. Don't overly grieve. Don't destroy yourself in grief. Don't allow the grief to rip you apart to the point where you can't cope. That's one extreme that you have to avoid, which is the explanation given by Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz. And the other extreme is that you don't feel the pain. Sometimes it's hard to express that pain. It's occluded, it's bottled up. And by tearing the garment, that's a physical act that demonstrates the loss, and then you begin to feel the pain and the emotions could come out. But one thing is clear, that the Jewish law and the approach to mourning is a gift that God gave us to be able to cope and find comfort, which we do in phases. It's a gradual process. And for every one of the stages, the first day stage, the Shiva, the 30 days, the 12 months, the Yartzeit, it's so therapeutic that it helps us cope and be able to go on with life. I remember as a child, there was a convert to Judaism. I still remember his name. He changed his name from Taylor to Abramson. He wanted to have a Jewish sounding name. And he was trained to be a Methodist minister. And I remember he came to a Shiva house that my father officiated at the funeral, and he tagged me along to the Shiva house. He didn't feel it was inappropriate for a child to be at a Shiva house. I wasn't a toddler. I was probably around almost bar mitzvah, or just bar mitzvah, I think. And this convert to Judaism told me that, and again, this is subjective, that where he comes from, he found that people could not cope with loss. They didn't know how to adjust to loss. And he found, and this is coming from an outsider who comes into the Jewish nation. And he says, I experienced something that I never saw before in the house of mourners that didn't have the gift of Shiva and the way to come and comfort a mourner. And here we have the quote from the Talmud: neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. Don't go to extremes. How are we expected to act? So again, a quote that we had before: 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, 30 days for new clothing, restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. Once these have elapsed, God declares, you are not more compassionate than I. I think it should be than me, but I'm not an expert in English grammar. At any rate, what is God saying? God saying, you think it doesn't bother me? God relates to our pain. And if I'm able to overcome that pain in the course of a year, of course, we're not God, but if God says, you're not more compassionate than me, if the mourning is a form of compassion, then I am able to cease that expression of that compassion through grief after a year. Obviously, you can't dictate emotions to people. And Jewish law is very much aware of that. Jewish law is just saying, don't try to exacerbate, don't try to accelerate and enhance the pain. Sometimes people feel it's a good thing to be sad, it's a good thing to grieve. And there's that story that we had at the beginning, that woman could never get over her loss. Now, some of it is natural and some of it is induced. Don't try to induce it. Don't induce more grief than you have to. And by using the guidelines of Jewish law, that's a help, that's an assistance to us in remaining close to the guidelines in terms of our emotions. And I think the Rebbe, when he after he lost his wife 30 days later, he expressed how difficult it was. Maimonides himself had suffered 3 major losses within, I think, a year. He lost his mother, he lost his first wife, he remarried later, and he lost his brother. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Maimonides went into depression for a year. How do we know this? He writes about it himself. He couldn't go out of his house. Why did he grieve so much for his brother? Well, the down-to-earth reason was his brother supported him and his family, and now he had to support his brother's family in addition to his own. But Maimonides was too spiritual to grieve more for his brother than for his mother and his own wife. But it was the straw that broke the camel's back. It's after losing a mother and a wife, and then to lose a brother, that was so devastating. So someone could come to Maimonides and say, 1 second, it's your brother. You only have to mourn for 30 days. But we're not talking about robots. We're not talking about automatons. We're talking about human beings. And Maimonides had to confess that he couldn't cope with it. It took him for a year or maybe more than a year. But what's important now is to discuss how we console a mourner. It's one of the hardest things. People don't really know what to say, and there are manuals to tell you what not to say, and nothing is etched in stone. Use a little common sense, but the most important approach to consoling a mourner is not saying anything necessarily. If you have a question is about whether what you say is the right thing, don't say it. Silence is sometimes better than saying something foolish that will not only not console the mourner, but might actually hurt them even more. So we try to restrict what we say, and according to Jewish law, we have to wait for the mourners to initiate the discussion. And until then, we are silent. I think. But then we do say words of consolation when we leave. And these are the words that are mentioned here on page 13. And in English translation, may the omnipresent one, the word God is not there, the word is omnipresent, console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. We're saying to this mourner who's grieving, may God comfort you. The word omnipresent means God who is present all over. May he comfort you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. So here there are a few questions. Question number 1, why call God omnipresent? Why not just say God? Question number two, why are we bringing in the other mourners of Zion in Jerusalem? How do the others get into this? So we're going to deal with each one of these. The first question is, why mention omnipresent, that God is present all over and not God? So the Rebbe gave a mystical answer. He refers to God. The God manifests himself in two ways. There's a God, same God, who is aloof, who is transcendent. He's above and beyond the world. He doesn't relate to the world because God is infinite and the world is finite. But then there's an aspect of God, the same God who relates to us the way a father and a mother, a spouse would relate to his or her children or spouse. God is sometimes referred to as our husband. He's sometimes referred to as our father, sometimes as our mother. But all these metaphors express an aspect of God who feels our pain, however we understand that, and relates to us intimately. And we're saying to this aspect of God, the aspect of God that is present within space, within the physical world. We're not talking to the God who is transcendent, relative to which nothing that happens in this world really has any significance. We're talking about the God that is in this world, who's part of this world, who cares for this world, who relates to this world, who grieves when we grieve, who rejoices when we rejoice. So we're saying that this aspect of God, we're calling on this aspect, that God should activate his fatherly presence in this world to comfort us. And that the truth is that only God can really comfort. People say that time heals. That's true. Time heals because God mandated it, ordained it to heal. God gave us the power of healing that takes place in the passage of time. I remember that this was in South Africa. I was speaking about this very subject, and parents came over to me and they said, it's 2 years since we lost in an accident 2 of our children, and we still cannot come back to normal. And they were challenging me, saying, what you said is not true, that time heals. So I said to them, 2 years ago, were you able to come to a rabbi and say to the rabbi, we haven't healed? Were you able to talk about it? Were you able to do anything? Were you just paralyzed with grief? And he said, yes. He says, well, it took 2 years for you to be able to even come and ask this question. So time does heal. For some people, it heals more quickly. For others, it takes a lifetime. But it does change. That's a gift that God gives us. Another explanation the Rebbe once gave is that the Hebrew word for omnipresent is makom. Makom, in Hebrew, every letter has a number, and there are 2 ways of dealing with that number. So if you add it up, it adds up to God's name, that God is concealed. If you take the letters of the word makom, and you square them, it adds up to a number that's equivalent to God's name. Whenever we use that gematria code, it's a symbol that whatever truth that it reveals, it's a hidden one. That God's goodness, we believe that God is good, always good. Sometimes his goodness is revealed, but with the death of a loved one, his goodness is concealed, but it's still there. We have to admit that God is still present. And there's a famous explanation, I don't remember what the source of it is, that loss, when we lose a loved one, it creates a void, an emptiness in our hearts. And we ask God to fill in that void. And by the way, how do we fill in that void? One of the ways we do that is by saying Kaddish. Kaddish is not a prayer that talks about death. Not a single word about death or dying in Kaddish. So why do mourners say Kaddish? Because Kaddish is where we glorify God, which means we're saying that, yes, we experienced a void. There's a vacuum in our life. We don't feel God's presence because God expresses himself through life. How do we see God's presence in a revealed way? When you see life, when you see vitality. When you look at a rock, you don't see the divine. Although there's a divine spark even in a rock, we don't see it. When we see a living being, a plant, an animal, and then a human being, and then you see a righteous human being, you see divine. But when someone dies, that divine is concealed. And when God is concealed, we have to reveal him. So by saying Kaddish, we're saying, God, even though you have been concealed by the loss of life, we're bringing you back into this loss. But then why Zion and Jerusalem? General Arik Sharon, who later on became the prime minister, was the hero of the Six-Day War. I'm sure some of you remember. With a few months after the Six-Day War, where he saved Israel, he experienced a tragic accident that his son, Gur, accidentally got hold of a weapon and discharged it and killed himself by accident. And Arik Sharon was so devastated, unimaginable. And he said that no one was able to comfort him except for the Rebbe. The Rebbe wrote him a letter. And in the letter, the Rebbe makes 3 points. We're going to just focus on 1 point. Why do we mention, among other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? Because Zion and Jerusalem, when we say Zion and Jerusalem, we're referring to the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, and the city of Jerusalem, which is the Holy City. Those institutions were destroyed, physically destroyed, utterly destroyed by the Babylonians and then by the Romans. Yet, we believe that the spiritual Holy Temple has never been destroyed. It's still here. Where is it? It's in our hearts. It's in our communities. It's in our synagogues. It's in our good deeds. God's presence is here in this world. And if we divest ourselves temporarily from materialistic pursuits, we're able to feel that presence of God in our lives. So just like the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, we're mourning the destruction of a physical structure, but we realize that the soul is still here. The soul of the temple is here, and the soul of the deceased is also still here. We should recognize that there's no real absolute loss. The loss of the physical body is tempered by the fact that the soul is still there, and we can still connect to the soul. As we discussed last week, that, and we'll add to it a little bit more today, that the soul, we could still connect to the soul. If you look on page 20, we'll skip over to page 20 for a moment. The bottom of the page, the final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds, commenting. This is what people should comment. So-and-so was upright. So-and-so was God-fearing. In other words, it's a good thing to praise the person who left this world. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about him. If they say that he has been upright and God-fearing, his soul immediately ascends to paradise. On page 18, I was really looking for page 18 mostly. When children say Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah, it's part of the Talmud, part of Torah, on their behalf, it is like sending them a letter, much more personal than just sending regards. And when they fulfill mitzvot, fulfill all the commandments and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it is like sending them an entire parcel. In other words, Kaddish is so important. We're not minimizing its importance, but studying Torah is even greater if you study Torah on the behalf of the deceased. And if you do mitzvahs and good deeds for their benefit, you give charity, it's even greater than that. It's like sending them an entire parcel. That's a quote from the Hasidic Rabbi, Rabbi Aaron of Karlin. The next 2 pages, 3 pages, I'm not going to go reading the whole thing. It's several sages, students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the greatest rabbi of his time. He was the leader, the spiritual leader of the Jewish people at the time the temple was destroyed. And he lost a child. and his students came to console him. And each one said something about other people who were consoled. Adam lost a child, and he was consoled. And Rabbi Yochanan was not comforted. He says, look, you just told me about someone else who suffered. Does that make me feel any better? If you tell someone, I know you're suffering, but your friend is suffering even more, does that make you feel better? If you're a normal human being, it'll make you feel worse. So I don't want to hear about other people suffering. And when the next student used a similar tact, he was not, Aaron lost two sons. He says, why are you bringing in Aaron's loss? It's going to make me feel even worse. And then another student came in, Rabbi Shimon, and he mentioned about King David, who had a son who died, and he was consoled. He says, why are you telling me about King David? You can make me feel even worse. And finally, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, who was his greatest student, he entered, and he told him not about some other people who suffered, but he gave him a parable. On page 17, you could read it if you want. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail, woe is to me, when will I emerge unharmed from the safekeeping role? In other words, you're given something by a king, you better watch it. If something happens to it, you're in big trouble. You, master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, the scriptures, the Mishnah, the Halacha, and the exegetical teachings. That's commentary on the Torah. And he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. And Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion, because, and it doesn't mean that other people will be comforted by this, but this is what comforted him, that you're told that your child was entrusted to you. You don't own your child. You don't own your parents. You don't own your spouse or your siblings. They are, to whatever extent that you are in charge of their well-being, they are a pledge that you have an obligation to watch, to guard over, and make sure that not only are they healthy and happy, but they are good and they're righteous. That's your responsibility as a parent. And when you give the child back to God without any damage, you should feel consoled. Again, not everyone will feel consoled with that, but that's what helped him. And the reason why the other things didn't help, because they weren't talking about him. They were not directing it to him. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach understood Rabbi Yochanan's nature and what would comfort him. Now let's talk a little bit about the Shiva house on page 19. To make things a little bit light, there's a joke they tell about a man who's on his deathbed and is just moments away from passing away. He's still alert and conscious. And he tells his wife that there's some chopped liver in the refrigerator. Could she give him some chopped liver? And her response was, we saved it for the Shiva. We cover the mirrors. I mentioned before that one of the reasons for that. The mourners are supposed to stay in the house. Only for really and very urgent matters do you leave the house, the Shiva house. You continue to wear your torn garment. You don't remove it until the end of the Shiva. At the end of the Shiva, you do remove it. You're supposed to sit on a low chair or stool, not on a regular chair. If you have a couch, you remove the pillow, that's good enough. No music, no leather shoes. We abstain from work or business. We don't go to work. We don't engage in business deals. Again, there could be some exceptions in cases of great urgency. If your business is going to shut down and you lose your livelihood because of that, that's a different story. We don't shave or take haircuts during this period. Actually, we don't do it until the 30 days are over. No marital intimacy during the Shiva. We even avoid studying Torah, because Torah brings joy, especially people who are steeped in the Torah study. It takes away from the atmosphere of mourning, except you can learn the laws of grieving and mourning and other parts of the Torah that deal with sad events, such as the story about the destruction of the temple. And it's customary for mourners, wherever they are able to lead the services and recite Kaddish, or at least recite the Kaddish. And there is a mitzvah, a commandment to comfort a mourner. Just like we're obligated to visit the sick, we have to comfort mourners also. These are rabbinic laws. The Torah does not mention the commandment to comfort a mourner, but Maimonides makes it clear that it's based on the commandment to love your fellow as yourself. Just like you would want to be comforted, so should you comfort others. But the specific commandment to comfort the mourner is rabbinical. What about comforting by phone, by calling them up and saying the words of consolation? It's better than nothing for sure, but it's not the best way of doing it, because one of the main objectives of comforting someone is just by being there. And that's based on the Talmud, and it says the reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence. And the mourner should dictate, as I mentioned before, the conversation. And one of the things that we're counseled, although there's no such commandment, it's just sound advice, don't attempt to lighten the mood, thinking that by cracking jokes, you're going to make the mourner feel better. Maybe in some cases that would do, but sometimes that causes the mourner to be distracted and they never cope with their loss. So in the moment, they feel better because you lighten the mood, but in the long run, they're going to be more devastated. Because you know what happens? I saw this with many people, that the Shiva was great. They were comforted, they felt good, because everyone came, relatives, friends, and there was activity going on in the house, and there was tons of food people would bring. As soon as the Shiva was over, they were devastated. They couldn't find comfort because everyone left, and now they're back to their normal routine, minus the relative, the loved one, that is no longer present. And all the relatives and friends are gone. So it's important to let people grieve. I know that's not what happens in Shiva houses, and most Shiva houses I've been at in over the last few decades, but people should look at that and reconsider the way they deal with mourners. We should also philosophize to try to figure out why this death, or people would say things like, what could we do? We can't do anything about it. Well, what are you? You're assuming that you could do something about it? We can't stop death. We shouldn't try to become theologians and philosophers. Obviously, if the mourner asks you a question about Jewish law, about Jewish view of death and mourning, you have to answer it, but don't overly accentuate that. And that we have to always remember, Shiva is not about avoiding pain, it's to process pain, even from the emotional aspect of Shiva. And avoid intrusive questions or comments. People will sometimes ask, do they suffer a lot? Now, maybe an innocent question, you may have good intentions, but you never know how that could be painful to the person whom you're asking. What you could talk about is the life of the deceased, the positive qualities. Put the focus on the deceased, because as we studied last week, part of mourning is not just for the mourners, the relatives, it's also for the soul of the departed. And their soul wants to hear positive things. And that's the reason for eulogies. Although there is a custom in some communities not to eulogize at the funeral. And the reason for that is because if you say too little, you're insulting the person. If you say too much, you're mocking the person. You can't say that a person who was known to be a criminal, a pathological liar, and say, well, this man was a paragon of virtue, and was such an honest person. It may make the relatives feel good about it if they're not too smart, but it's an insult, really, and it's not good. It's not good in how the soul is judged when people say too much. So you have to try to not exaggerate a person's qualities. You could focus on them. You don't have to give a report of the person's entire life and go through everything the person did, good or bad, and say, well, I want to be honest. No, it's not a mitzvah to be honest by telling things that are not relevant to the person who has to hear your words of consolation. Focus on the positive. So what were the key points that we discussed? Everyone reacts to and deals with grief differently. No two people are psychologically alike, and no two circumstances of death and bereavement are the same. Yet, Judaism does mandate certain standards of mourning and grieving and consolation. And we should stick to those guidelines as best as we can and try to improvise sometimes about this particular individual subjective situation, and knowing that in certain cases you should avoid saying certain things that you could say in other places. 2, it is a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. It's not optional. Processing a loss is critical to the healing process as well. This is accomplished by Shiva, a mandatory period of grieving. And as I said before, that's not the reason for Shiva to heal, but that's what Shiva accomplishes as well. Number 3, the Torah validates and encourages mourning, but only for a prescribed period of time, after which the mourner is commanded to transition back to normal life. In other words, if a person losing a parent, a year goes by and they say, I insist on not attending any joyous events because I'm mourning my loss of my parents, that's wrong. Don't create more practical ways of grieving beyond the time that is allotted to you by Jewish law. If you feel it in your heart and you can't get it out of your heart, then you might need some counseling, you might need therapy, which is always advisable, but don't induce it. That's a very important point. Number 4, some ideas that give a mourner the strength to move on. A, the knowledge that the soul lives on and is not diminished by death. B, it is never too late to mend or improve our relationship with the deceased. Though our physical relationship has ended, we can still give him or her spiritual gifts. In fact, in Jewish law, there are discussions about how if a person offended someone and never had a chance to ask for forgiveness, you can go to the person's graveside and ask for forgiveness there. The soul hears. Sometimes you should take, in some cases, 10 people with you. There are different standards about that, but there is a concept of going to the graveside and mending whatever offenses you have to mend. Number C, life is a deposit, and God decides when to give it and when it must be returned. And number D, for this soul and its unique mission, this constituted a full life. This person lived a full life. And 5, there's a mitzvah to comfort mourners. The most basic principle of comforting a mourner is simply being there. Our presence offers comfort and lessens the loneliness that often accompanies mourning. And again, you can express consolation, condolences over the phone. You can send a letter, condolences, especially to people who live overseas. But wherever there's a possibility of doing it in person, that's preferable, because that's really the strongest form of comfort, when you actually show you're there and you're participating in the person's grief. You're not there to philosophize. You're not there to wax eloquent. You're there just to be a source of comfort.